The Michael Penix era is over. Where do the Falcons turn next?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast. I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Sirius Black. Welcome to Locked On Falcons, the daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And of course, the Locked On Podcast Network is now the number one sports podcast network in the galaxy. And today's Locked On Falcons is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can bet just $5. And if your bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets to use all across the app. So Locked On is number one, thanks to you, the everydayers that tune into this humble podcast, this illustrious podcast, as well as the plethora of shows that are across this podcast network. We appreciate the everydayers that make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer and be part of the number one podcast network in the galaxy is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So for the everydayers and the newcomers, today's episode, we are talking about the fallout of finding out Wednesday morning/afternoon that Michael Penix will be having season-ending surgery on his partially torn ACL, and why this is pretty much, we won't say the nail in the coffin, but pretty much ends this era of the Michael Penix era. We'll break down why. We'll break down why ownership needs to get on board with a reset, given the fallout of this situation. And, we'll talk about all the problems that the Falcons are going to need to solve if and when that reset comes in the near future on today's episode. So we will be back later with a crossover Thursday. So you're getting a bonus episode today here on the pod. So if you missed the news, Michael Penix is having season-ending ACL, season-ending reconstruction surgery on a partially torn ACL. And that timeline, as we've discussed already on the podcast, but want to rehash that for those that may have missed it. That timeline for when he will be able to get back on the field is 9 or more months. And I know, I'm not an expert, but my understanding of, the fact that it's a partial ACL tear versus a full tear doesn't really make a difference, because my understanding is the 9-month recovery is based off of the surgery. Basically, doctors cutting you open and sticking all the things that they stick into you. It's not the 9-month recovery has nothing to do with the ligament. Now, because it's a partial tear, there's probably a better prognosis for Penix coming out better from the surgery than it would be if it was a full tear. But that's my understanding of the situation. But I'm sure as we learn more information and we'll get back, haven't had to spend too much time thinking about ACLs with, major Falcon players basically since Jamal Anderson in 1999. But we'll be updated on that. So what that timetable does means that he's going to pretty much miss the entire offseason. And instead of working on his game, improving as he needs to at this stage in his career, he's going to be spending the entire offseason rehabbing. And unfortunately, that timetable 9 months from now would be, mid to late August. And so therefore, he's not going to be in a position to start week 1 in 2026, and may not be in a position to start, until much, much later in 2026. And so essentially that means he cannot be your plan A at the quarterback position in 2026, which it seemed like the Falcons were on the path for based off of this current year. Now, could he absolutely come back at some point in October or later in 2026 and play well? Yes, that is possible, but that cannot be your plan A if you're the Atlanta Falcons. That is, as we'll explain, mostly a dart throw at this point in time, as opposed to like a legitimate plan for you. And so in the meantime, you're going to have to, at the very least, bring in a bridge quarterback that should not be Kirk Cousins, no matter how effective Kirk Cousins is for these next 7 games. If he's effective for the next 7 games, he's going to cost you about a $57.5 million cap hit next year. There's no real path to running that back with Kirk. Even if you can convince Kirk somehow to take less money, like he's a 37-year-old quarterback, just move on at this point. Like that ship has sailed at this point in time. And, there'll be plenty of options for that bridge option for the Falcons in 2026. whether they're good options is certainly a debatable topic of conversation. But essentially, the Falcons are kind of rewinding the clock as we head into this offseason to where they were at the end of the 2023 year when Desmond Ridder didn't work out and Arthur Smith was on the way out. And, in that 2024 offseason, they were like, Kirk is going to be our guy. He's going to be our very expensive bridge quarterback for the next 2 years until we turn the keys to Michael Penix. I don't think the Falcons are going to go for an expensive bridge like a Daniel Jones, like a Kyler Murray or something like that. They'll probably go cheap this time, which they weren't willing to do in 2024. You go down one path, doesn't work out. So what happens? You go down the opposite path, right? You hire a player-friendly coach like Dan Quinn, then you go with a hard-nosed coach like Arthur Smith. You fire him, and you go with a player-friendly coach like Raheem Morris. So, that's kind of the back and forth of that situation. So the Falcons will probably go with a cheaper bridge, like many people thought they should have done back in 2024. And you're just kind of hoping to line yourself up to maybe take another swing at the quarterback at the top of the 2027 draft when you have a first-round pick, which you do not have heading into this offseason. And you're hoping that 27 quarterback class is going to be better than the 26 quarterback class that, by many accounts may have a couple of options in the top 10, which you won't be picking for reasons that you guys are all aware of. But we all know that, just wait until next year. That mantra that is applied to every draft when it comes to the quarterback position is fleeting at best. So we'll just have to hope that 2027 is going to be one of those years where it is worth waiting for with the Falcons. Right now, it seems that way, but again, as we've discussed many times over the years, you can't trust in that. So we'll see if that works, and hopefully it'll work. Right. We'll see. I had someone on Twitter when I basically was talking about this on Wednesday morning, basically asked me, what makes you believe that 2027 quarterback in round one is going to be a better option than Michael Penix? And my response to it, it's I don't have any reason to believe that. That's an irrational opinion to, think that quarterback is automatically going to be better than Michael Penix. The draft is a crapshoot, and we know that quarterback is the biggest crapshoot when it comes to drafting players. It is a shot in the dark, but ultimately the Falcons have to figure out the quarterback position in order to have long-term sustainable success again, so that they don't go on an 8-year playoff drought, right? The reason why they, spent the previous decade, without this 8-year playoff drought, having, going to the playoffs most years, was because they had stability at the quarterback position. And so the Falcons have to find that. And right now, Michael Penix, given his injury, given the fact that he's not going to be potentially playing that much next year, if at all, we'll see, is not a stable answer for the Falcons at the quarterback position. And so basically that's why I sit here and I say the Penix era is over, because, again, maybe he comes back strong and plays better and saves that position, but that is not a viable plan. That is more of a dart throw. And so essentially you're sitting in a situation where, Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot, they took 2 swings at the quarterback position in Kirk Cousins and Michael Penix. Neither have worked out so far. And so they took their shots, and now it's time for somebody else to take a shot, because both of these guys should be out the building by the end of the season. And all they're really doing is just, stewarding over the sinking ship that is the 2025 Atlanta Falcons for the next 7 weeks at this point in time. And somebody else should be getting an opportunity to take their swings at the quarterback position, as well as other areas of concern, which we'll break down later in today's episode. But first, the question is going to be, the big question is, will new people get that opportunity, right? Is ownership going to get on board with, doing this reset that needs to happen after this season? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons.
Today's show is brought to you by our friends over there at Peloton. Look, folks, it's time to break through the busiest time of the year with a brand new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus that's powered by Peloton IQ. It's Peloton's most elevated technology and equipment yet that gives you real-time guidance, and it gives you endless ways to move, whether you want to work out by yourself or if you want to work out with your favorite instructor, like my personal favorite, Alex Toussaint. He always gets me fired up to tackle the day. And the thing I like about Peloton, it helps me achieve more in less times. They have features that help you plan, stay motivated, track your progress, and Peloton IQ also provides personalized workout plans and recommendations. That's something that I use right now during the busiest time of the year covering the NFL. They plan my workouts for me based on my mood, my vibe, and also my favorite instructors. So make sure you check it out and use it because it also helps you correct your form in real time and it maximizes your reps. It counts your reps so that you can do it smarter, safer, and more efficient. Let yourself run, lift, flex, push, and go. Explore the new Peloton cross-training Tread Plus at onepeloton.com.
Today's episode is also brought to you by Georgia Access. Have your health or family needs changed lately? Georgia's got you covered. Georgia Access is our state's marketplace for Georgians to compare, apply, and enroll in health insurance plans that offer the best value for their individual needs. Open enrollment is happening right now. Just visit georgiaaccess.gov today. Georgia Access, health insurance for Georgia by Georgia. So I want to once again thank all of you that are everydayers or newcomers to Locked On Falcons, and you are the reasons why Locked On Podcast Network is the number one podcast network, sports podcast network, I should say, in America, which means number one in the world. Because if you're number one in America, you're number one in the world. You know, American football is definitely the most popular sport in the world because it's the most popular sport in America, and there's no other sport by the name of football. That's how that works. But if you're number one in the world, you're number one in the solar system. And if you're number one in the solar system, you're number one in the galaxy until, you know, the global Glocks alien sports podcast network comes for the throne. But all that goofiness aside, the big question is going to be, is ownership willing to sign off on a rebuild or reset? Now, you've heard me a number of times on this podcast over the last few days and weeks say the word reset as opposed to a rebuild, because reset lacks the connotation that comes with a rebuild, which a rebuild usually connotes, right? That you're going to tear it all down before you build it back up again. And so I prefer the term reset just because it doesn't have that connotation. And so you, as the, you know, illustrious listener of the Locked On Falcons podcast, can, you know, fill that space with whatever you vision as a reset, whether that's, you know, taking one step back so you can take two steps forward, or whether you see that as fully, we're going to tear it all down and tear this thing down to the studs and take 2 or 3 steps back so that we can take 5 steps forward or whatever. Again, that is up to you. I'm not trying to impose my will on that sort of situation, but as by the end of today's episode, you're going to understand that there's a lot of issues that the Falcons are going to have to address and many different avenues in which they can address them. But ultimately, at the end of the day, their success and failure is going to be based around their ability to solve those problems, and how they do it is, you know, up in the air. But that will be an ongoing conversation. Now, what I will add to that is I think it's in the Falcons' best interest to, quote unquote, bottom out in 2026 to best position themselves for a high pick in 2027 in order to maximize their chances of hitting on a quarterback that year. Okay. Now, again, what bottoming out means, you know, again, is debatable, but essentially the higher you pick, the better it is with the quarterback position. If you're an everyday of this podcast for a number of years, you know that I don't necessarily believe that draft order matters that much. It's very much overrated, but the exception to that rule is, like all the exceptions when it comes to this sport that is definitely the most popular sport on the planet in American football, is the quarterback position. That is always the exception to the rule. And we know that draft order does matter, that we know that the outcomes for a number 1 overall pick is better than a top 5 pick, is better than a top 10 pick, is better than a mid to late first round pick, or better than a day 2 pick, or better than a day 3 pick, or an undrafted free agent at that specific position quarterback we're talking about. As the draft wears on, your outcomes dip, right? There is a direct correlation to draft position and success in the NFL at the quarterback position, which is not that strong a correlation with any other position group across in this sport in this league. But, you know, again, so that's what I mean by bottoming out. Again, whether that means going 2-15, whether that means going 5-12, again, whatever that is in your mind. But, you know, in the meantime, between now and the 2027 draft, you got to get that bridge quarterback. You know, you hope Penix comes back better in 2026. I know the Falcoholic put together an article Wednesday morning that had a plethora of options. You know, we'll probably unpack some of those options in the coming days and weeks and whatnot. And to me, which path the Falcons need to go down at that position in the short term at the quarterback position until that 2027 draft, I think will heavily depend on who is calling the shots, who's making the decisions next year. And this is kind of why Arthur Blank kind of holds all the cards to whether or not this team can turn this thing around, right? It's not a foregone conclusion as we sit here today on November 19th, 2025, that Raheem Morris and Terry Fontenot will get fired at the end of the season. We are making that assumption here on this podcast because in our eyes, it is the most obvious choice to make, but we know the Falcons are going to Falcon, and they don't always make the right choices, right? That's kind of why they're on an 8-year playoff drought, because they don't always make the right choices. And it could very easily be a scenario where the people in that building, Raheem, Terry, and others, convince ownership, Arthur Blank, that, well, injuries derailed the season, right? And we are going to be able to get this thing back on track in 2026. We're going to have a rebound season. And, at today's presser on Wednesday, Raheem Morris, when it was being asked about Michael Penix's future, he was talking like a man that, is going to be here in 2026. Now, of course, what else is he going to do at this point in time? But it is not a guarantee that Arthur Blank is going to move on from those people if they can convince him that, it was just bad luck that ruined the Falcons 2025 season. And we'll be right back in the playoff mix in 2026. Now, if you are an everyday of this podcast, you know that I'm skeptical of that being a reality, and we'll break down exactly all the reasons why I think that is. But we know over the last 8 years, Arthur Blank has really had no stomach for a rebuild. I think some of that is owed to the fact that they have a brand new stadium. Mercedes-Benz Stadium opened up in 2017, right? The last time the Falcons made the playoffs. The process of building that stadium had, hundreds of millions of dollars being borrowed, and you got to pay back those loans, which is why you got to get people to renew their season tickets, renew those PSLs, those personal seat licenses. So there are financial incentives that you got to get as many butts in the seats, and losing football games does not put butts in the seats, particularly in the city of Atlanta. But my understanding of that situation, all of this is above my pay grade. So, I may be talking out, of orifices other than my mouth when I talk about this stuff. But from what I understand, the repayments of those loans, were set in stone like a decade ago. And there's like 15 more years of those repayments that are set already, that basically by the time the naming rights for Mercedes-Benz Stadium runs out in 2042 is when all those debts are supposed to be repaid. All those loans are supposed to be paid back. And, television money, the naming rights are all contributing to that. And so hopefully for those of us that are the peasants here, like, we're not sitting here where, he's forced to have to, we can't, we got to get, the reason why we haven't been able to rebuild and is because we got to get as many butts in the seats so we can pay back those loans. It's basically for us peasants. I know I have personal experience with this, and I'm sure many of you do. It's like when you don't have quite enough money to pay your taxes in April, you get on a payment plan with the IRS. I've been on many a payment plan over the years, especially since the start of COVID in 2020, over the last 5 years, with the IRS, where they take a cut out of your check every single month and basically say you owe us this type of money. And that's kind of the situation. And hopefully that situation is resolved and the Falcons have all the money to do that. That's basically the point I'm trying to make. And so they're not basing their decisions on, well, we got to pay back these loans is basically what I'm getting at. So, if money has been holding back ownership, hopefully that's a non-issue moving forward. Time might be the issue, right? That's been holding back ownership from embracing a reset/rebuild, right? Arthur Blank is an 83-year-old cancer survivor. There's a ticking clock for him. And does he want to wait multiple years for a rebuild, right? We'll see. Now, I think the best case scenario for the Falcons is, they take a little step back in 26, hit on a quarterback in 2027. Hopefully that quarterback is giving you similar results as what we've seen most recently with like Drake May, right? Where, he was the pick in 24. The Patriots are right now, I think, tied for the best record in football in 2025. And look like they have a bright future. So year 2 jump we saw for Drake May. And so if that's the case, then maybe this Falcons team is competing and competitive at the highest levels in 2028. That's kind of your best case scenario. So you might have to take a step back, hoping that you take a big step forward. And, at that point, Arthur Blank will be 86. Hopefully he'll be hoisting the Lombardi Trophy at some point between then and his 90th birthday in 2032. That's kind of your best case scenario at this point in time. But they could also just as easily whiff. And in fact, the odds are more likely that they'll whiff on that quarterback in 2027, just because the hit rate on quarterback is not over 50%, even in the first round. And then, you spend 3 years hoping that guy turns into your answer. And then, you're back in the mix in 2029, 2030, whenever it is. You're Arthur Blank, you're approaching your 90th birthday, and you're not in any better a situation than you were when you were 83, 84 at this point in time. And it's understandable, right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, it is people that are making the decisions for this football team, whether we're talking about the owner, whether we're talking about the coach, whether we're talking about the GM. Human beings have flaws, ladies and gentlemen. And so I understand it on a human level, where if I would imagine if I was in Arthur Blank's shoes at 83, knowing that there's a ticking clock, that I would not necessarily be willing to embrace a full out rebuild at this point in time. I want to win right now, right? I know you as listeners, you've been waiting 8 years of it in Azkaban, right? You don't want to wait another 2 or 3 years hoping, praying that it's going to work. You want that win to come right now. I get it, guys. But I think there are hard choices that are going to be had. There's going to be a lot of voices, as I said, in that building that have jobs at stake to try to push Arthur Blank from making those hard choices. And so that's also a factor in it. It's, again, human beings influencing human beings. And they're going to tell him, hey, Art, Mr. Blank, you got to stay the course. You just got to be patient, right? Borrow a page from the Rooneys. Just be patient, and we're going to figure this thing out. I think that would be the wrong decision. Like I said, hard choices got to be made. We'll hope that Arthur Blank makes those hard choices. And let's talk about some of those hard choices, and so that you understand why I sit here thinking that the reset is a correct path for this team moving forward. And we'll break that down as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. The NBA season is back, and there's no better place to get in on that action than when FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Whether you miss opening tip-off or you're just looking to ride the hot hand, FanDuel is going to have live bets on everything from who's going to score next to those fourth quarter comebacks. You can combine those live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team is making that late game push. And so whether you want to bet on the Hawks or some other NBA team, or you're still invested in the NFL season, you can do so by heading on over to FanDuel.com. And new customers can bet just $5. And if that bet wins, you'll get $300 in bonus bets. Again, that's $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. And if you want to use that on this upcoming Week 12 action between the Falcons and Saints, the Saints are now 1.5-point favorites over the Falcons, in large part due to Penix's injury, Drake London's injury. So if you want to bet that, head on over to FanDuel.com to sign up. Download the FanDuel app. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. So, the big discourse and debate that you see raging in the comments here, on various social media platforms when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons is, coaching is the only problem the Falcons have. Coaching is the biggest problem the Falcons have, but it's not the only problem the Falcons have, right? And this is ultimately, my issue is, as I'll explain, people tend to hyperfixate on what's the number one problem and ignore problems like 2 through 8. And one of the things that we try to do here on this podcast is everybody can look at this and say yes, we know coaching is the big issue. If you've been listening to this podcast basically since January, we have been talking about the coaching not being very good, even going back to last year's 8-9 season, and where the coaching let this team down more so than the quarterback did, contrary to popular opinion at that time, even in 2024. One of the things we try to pride ourselves here on this podcast is not to do the so obvious thing of just hyperfixating on the number one issue, but also trying to break down issues 2, 3, 4, all the way through 8, etc. So we'll leave the quarterback situation aside for now, but let's talk about some of the issues that the Falcons are going to have to deal, which is why I sit here and I say a reset is the best path forward for the Falcons. Just look at the skill position group, right? Tyler Algier and Kyle Pitts are headed to free agency. That leaves your skill position group basically Drake London and Bijan Robinson, right? Both of those guys are set to get paid a lot of money in the next couple of off seasons. And so they represent viable options to build your offense around, but that's about it, right? You need to get a new RB2. You need to get a whole new wide receiver core because you're going to cut Darnell Mooney this offseason. You're going to have to replace Kyle Pitts at the tight end position. So that skill room is going to get rebuilt, right? It's just going to get rebuilt around Drake and Bijan, but it's still going to have to get rebuilt. So a lot of work That's not one offseason. That's not, hey, we'll just plug in a couple of cheap free agents or some late round picks and boom, we solved it, right? So that's going to take multiple off seasons to reset and rebuild. The offensive line is going to have to be rebuilt and reloaded, right? You're going to run it back in 26 with the same starting five because Terry Fontenot set it up that way, and you don't really have too many pivot options. So same starting five you currently have with Caleb McGarry coming back, but beyond that, no idea, right? The three guys that are under contract in 2027, Jake Matthews is going to be 35, Chris Lindstrom's going to be 30, and Caleb McGarry is going to be 32 that year. Ryan Newsel is going to be a free agent. He'll be 30 at that point. Matthew Bergeron is also going to be a free agent. You cannot sit here and tell me that this offensive line is basically it's you have one more year of this current group, and then you're going to have to start making replacements. Now, maybe you can get away with doing that piecemeal over multiple years, but like this is not a sustainable group. So you're going to have brand new, multiple new starters over the next 2 to 3 years on your offensive line. So that needs to be rebuilt. The D-line, you have a nice foundation of young pieces to continue to build. James Pierce, Jalen Walker, Zach Harrison, Brandon Dorlus, Ruka Roro. But you need 8 to 10 guys in your D-line rotation. And we know that this current group of players, as talented as they are not a great D-line yet, right? In terms of being able to get reliable pressure with 4, being able to stop the run. That has not been the description of this current defensive line. And so you're going to have to continue to add pieces, right? Right now, as we sit here today, Jalen Walker and Zach Harrison are your 2 most likely 3-down players, right? James Pierce, great pass rusher, terrible run defender. Rook and Dorlus are, we'll see. We'll see with them. It's like some weeks they're good run defenders and some weeks they're not. Some weeks they're good pass rushers and some weeks they're not. So again, you still need to continue building up your defensive line. You've gotten the ball rolling, but you got to keep investing in that, guys. It's not over, contrary to popular opinion. The Falcons, we drafted it. We're done. We're good here. Linebacker, Caden Ellis is a free agent this year. Divine Diablo is going into a contract next year. Caden Ellis is going to be 31 next year if you re-sign him. Divine Diablo is going to be 29 next year. So you need to start planning for life after one or both of these guys right now in the future. So that's another issue, even if you consider that to be relatively stable for the next couple of years, right? Cornerback, AJ Terrell is 27. So presumably we got 3 more years left of AJ Terrell's prime, but what about the other cornerback position? And then what about Billy Bowman? I don't personally think Billy Bowman is a long-term option at the nickel cornerback spot. I know that's going to be a controversial take to a lot of folks, but to me, he's just a stopgap, and so you still need to address that position. Now, maybe you move Billy Bowman to safety because Jesse Bates is entering a contract year in 2026. Now, you're good with Xavier Watts. He looks like he's going to be a long-term option there, but Jesse Bates is going to be 29 next year going into his contract year. We know running back is kind of safety is the running back of the defense, given that it has a short shelf life than any other position on defense. Do you extend Jesse Bates or do you start grooming Billy Bowman to be his replacement? That to me seems a more viable option than thinking Billy Bowman's going to be your starting nickel for the next couple of years. But if that's the case, you kind of just wasted his rookie season trying to make him into a nickel when in reality his long-term future is as a safety. So you just delayed his development for a full year. So that's why I sit here and I say changing the head coach and or offensive coordinator is not solving any of these problems. It solves the problem of getting a better head coach and a better offensive coordinator, right? Firing the general manager solves the problem of getting a better GM, but ultimately that GM success hinges on his ability to solve these problems. And so this is why I sit here, and you've heard me rail against complacency these last several years, right? The last 8 years, we get it, guys. Like the Falcons were trying to spend the last 8 years to get back to the heights that they experienced in 2016. It did not work. It's time to move on and start over. And now you just have to look at this current season as your 06 season, right? And the question is going to be, we don't want to necessarily go back to 07, right? But you kind of have to have that kind of reset so that you can set yourself up for 2027 to be 2008, where you hit that quarterback, you find your Matt Ryan, and then the next decade, it's off to the races. So that to me is what the Falcons need to do. Will they do that? We will see, right? So to me, when it comes to Arthur Blank and ownership, he's going to be 83. Is he going to be around for that decade of success that we're hoping to come in from 2027 to 2036 or whatever? Probably not. Maybe he's down around for some of it. But to me, if I'm Arthur Blank, if I'm giving him advice rather than the Rich McKays and the Terry Fontenos and the Raheem Morrises out there that have self-interest in saving their jobs, if I'm just looking at, hey, Arthur Blank, it's about the Atlanta Falcons and your legacy. It's not about your legacy anymore. It's about your son's Josh. You're grooming him to take over the family business. You need to set him up for long-term success. Now, whether he takes over the family business in 2028 or 2038, we have no idea, but you need to set up your son for long-term success. You need to be a good father. You need to borrow a page from Marcus Mariota and devote your time and energy to being a great father. And if that means quitting on Terry Fontenot rather than quitting on the Atlanta Falcons, right? Mariota quit on the Falcons a couple of years ago to go be a father. We need Arthur Blank to quit on the current decision makers in Atlanta and not quit on, and you won't be quitting on the Atlanta Falcons if you go be a great father and set up your son, Josh. So fire the GM, fire the head coach, and yes, you got to fire Rich McKay, right? I don't think Rich McKay is the problem. Jarvis and I talked about this a couple of weeks ago. He is not the problem. But if you want to signal to this fan base, a lot of Falcon fans think he's the problem. And if you want to signal to this fan base that you're serious about setting up your son for success and setting up the last however many years you are on this mortal coil called Earth that is home to the #1 sports podcast network, if you're serious about that, you got to make a move with Rich McKay. You got to signal that. So this is going to be an ongoing topic of conversation. We got 7 weeks left of the season. We'll continue to talk about the upcoming games, but we're going to start pivoting a lot of these conversations towards the future. But our next conversation is going to be crossover Thursday. So quarterback is going to remain a huge topic of conversation. And I want to make it clear, we are not closing the door on Michael Penix, but he's no longer your plan A, right? He's going to spend the next 9 to 12 months spending more time on the trainer's table than he's going to be in the lab or on the practice field developing as a quarterback. And that's why we spent the last month focusing so much on Michael Penix, because he's not a finished product. We've been talking about this for several months, that he's not a finished product. We've been breaking down all the things he needs to improve upon, and now he's not going to really get that opportunity to do so, because the next time he's going to be able to step on a football field, he's going to be the backup quarterback, not getting reps in season, all that stuff. We've seen Penix come off the bench without first team reps and play well. Maybe you get a repeat of that in 2026. We'll see. But that can't be your plan. Well, Penix is going to come back and save us, right? He's just going to burst through the training room tables and be like wearing a cape and be like, I'm going to save you guys. That is not a plan for the Falcons. That is a dart throw at best. And maybe you get lucky and it hits the bullseye, but you cannot present that as a viable plan moving forward for this organization. And if the current front office and coaching staff try to convince Blank of that, he needs to shut that down. But we will see on that front. So your next episode will be a crossover Thursday with myself and Ross Jackson of Locked On Saints. It's already been recorded. I apologize in advance if I don't sound particularly rosy about it, just because, this news of Penix was, impending at the time when we were recording that. And so it is what it is, baby. But, we'll talk about this week 12 matchup between the Falcons and Saints. It is hate week after all. But, we're going to spend a lot of time, as in addition to, breaking down all these games and what's at stake. Instead of doing the thing that I think a lot of people do is let's just point fingers, we're going to try to focus on finding solutions. That was something myself and Ross Jackson were talking about of Locked On Saints off air, and not on that crossover Thursday. Basically him giving me the advice of what is it like covering a bad football team that this season is pretty much cooked. And so that's going to be a lot of the focus moving forward here on Locked On Falcons. So it's a dark time, guys. It's a dark time, but hopefully there is light at the end of the tunnel, but we will see if we get there. So continue to make Locked On Falcons your first listen. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL. It's all part of the #1 sports podcast network on the planet and in the galaxy, the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.